Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I thought I would chat with you guys a little bit about why I personally do so many sets of 10 and why I have most of my clients do large numbers of sets of 10 on supplemental lifts, even as someone who I'm very big into strength. Obviously, I care about max strength and I train maxes every single week, and the system I use focuses on maxes every single week. So the question becomes, why 10s? Because this is kind of the sort of question we used to ask with more minimalist training of why 5s, right? Why 5s? Well, we had reasons for that, particularly for novice lifters. But when we get people out of the novice phase and we want to start working on things like maximum strength, the thing that we generally find is that most of the benefits from more moderate reps tend to come already from the heavy work, the max work. So if you're already training down in the 1 to 3 rep range, most of the mechanical tension benefits that you would get in terms of your strength improvements and so on from doing moderately heavy weights with moderate reps, they get largely negated by that. Now, obviously, doing 5s and 6s and things like that are still going to build more hypertrophy. They're going to build more muscle than doing heavy singles will, so they would have an advantage there. But when we step over and we start looking at exercise economy, time efficiency, stuff like that, if we're already getting the benefits of heavy mechanical tension and we're already getting training and practice towards doing maxes, right? If we're already getting practice from doing maxes, there's not really a lot of benefit in terms of the heavier mechanical loading from more moderate rep ranges. In fact, when we take skill out of the equation, and skill comes from things like neuromuscular efficiency, coordination, things like that, us learning to do these big movement patterns, there's a reason why doing big multi-joint movements even improves certain aspects of athleticism. There's a coordination involved, right? There's coordination involved. Now, when we measure strength that looks at different studies that's out there, we measure strength that has been obtained through different pathways. What we oftentimes find that for single joint strength, the amount of tension you use in your training doesn't seem to matter that much. People say, what? What do you mean? Well, when we look at different studies, we know that if heavier loading is used, that things like 1 rep max strength tends to increase more if the same amount of hypertrophy is developed. In other words, when we take trials on lifters who do large numbers of heavy 3 rep sets, who build the same hypertrophy that people doing 3 sets of 10 do, right? And this has been studied, they do build the same amount of muscle. What happens? They tend to be slightly stronger when they test their maxes. Why? Because they practice lifting heavier weights. They've lifted heavier loads by doing 3 rep sets instead of 10. Therefore, they have better skill towards lifting really heavy weights, so therefore their strength measures higher. When we measure them on multi-joint exercises, what happens when we just measure a single joint exercise? Well, we find that it doesn't matter. We find that if we lock someone in to where they are forced to isolate a muscle, that the only thing that matters is their individual leverages and hypertrophy and stuff. The rep ranges that they use to develop the strength that we display when they're locked into a machine and we measure their single joint movement strength, like purely a bicep or purely a quad, we find that hypertrophy becomes really all that matters. So if hypertrophy is all that matters, then our hypertrophy work that's outside of our big heavy skill type work may not be that important. May not be that important even for improving strength. We just need to get bigger. We just need to get bigger in the right places. So what's the fastest way to do that? 10s is a really good rep range for that. It's a really good rep range for that, because we can do very few sets and get quality volume in. In other words, 3 to 5 sets of 10 can stimulate a pretty enormous amount of muscle growth, and it can do so in a relatively short time, because we don't need always as much recovery between sets. When you're doing, limit sets with sets of 10, you can take fairly short breaks, which may in some cases force you to use a little bit less weight, but you can take short breaks and you get a lot of work density done, a lot of training volume done. You can stimulate a lot of hypertrophy relative to the amount of time that you just spent doing it. And we don't have to deal with the additional issues of sometimes dealing with really, really heavy weights, and heavy being relative to your strength level. We don't have to deal with some of the recovery downsides of that. So if we're already getting a lot of the strength benefits from doing our heaviest work, it makes sense to be a little more efficient in doing that. Now, a lot of people will look at that and say, well, why tens or why mostly tens? If that's the case, couldn't you just do 15s or 20s or things like that? Well, we might do that for some exercises. Well, it comes into a different situation. There's a bit of scientific debate out there that argues about myofibular versus sarcoplasmic growth. And we know that both occur. Both occur when any real hypertrophy is stimulated. But there's at least some data, and there's guys like Lyle and Minnow and other people who discuss that stuff, that would indicate that particularly when we start going above about 10 reps, that the hypertrophy isn't always balanced. And if it ends up being true, and the data seems to possibly support that, I don't want to say that it is true, then in terms of gaining strength, the hypertrophy that we're gaining from that may not be as totally beneficial to strength. Now, we know with tens it is, at least when it's measured on single joint exercises. It's just that when we go to multi-joint stuff, that's when we know that the heavier weight produces better strength, even relative to the hypertrophy. So when we come over then to some of our smaller movements that we're just using to develop muscle, that's all we care about using them for is hypertrophy. And I'm not saying that strength doesn't matter to hypertrophy, because it does, so getting strong will help your hypertrophy. But if we only care about using those movements to develop hypertrophy in the right places, well, we don't necessarily care about being able to lift really heavy weights in them. Right? I mean, stuff I'm doing in all these is pretty light. You guys see me doing a bunch of 225 close grip benches. That's not super heavy. I'm doing dips against bands, not with a lot of weight. Same thing, I was doing probably like 335 glute bridges for sets of 10. These are not particularly heavy weights. They're moderate weights. But done for, 5 sets of 10, you accumulate a large amount of volume, large amount of hypertrophy. But we're not as worried about the mechanical tension. But conversely, we also don't necessarily want to risk creating junk muscle either. Because if any of us care about performance and strength, and I'm going to assume if you're on this channel you do care about performance and strength, that you're not a bodybuilder per se, you actually care about being able to perform, not just being big, then the quality may matter. And so I might look at that and say, well, there's no reason for us to frequently, other than an occasional exercise, to really do more than about 10. Right? We don't necessarily need to do the 5 to 6 rep range, because it's kind of a junk range if we're doing max work. And we don't necessarily want to go above about 10 to 12 at the most. We don't really want to go above that, because we are risking getting some non-functional hypertrophy, again, depending upon if the data is true or not. So right around 10 seems to be kind of a sweet spot for your volume work. Now, am I saying that it has to be exactly 10? No. Am I saying that there aren't exceptions to it? No, there could be exceptions. There might be times when you, in your training, you just feel more comfortable doing sets of 20 on a certain lift. Maybe it's hard to load it to 10 with the equipment you have. Maybe stuff like a band face pull. It's kind of hard to get exact bands that are around 10 reps to failure. I can't find that. Usually mine end up being like 15 to 25 and not really finding much in the way of bands in between. So there's going to be, sometimes you're just going to have exercises where the equipment you have available or the comfort to set it up might lend itself to a bit more. There might be exercises that you want to do for a little bit of hypertrophy, to where just getting to 10s just wins you. It wins you, it floors you, and you can't do them. Now, I might argue that you need to stick to heavy work on those exercises if that's the case, and use some smaller stuff to grow extra muscle mass. I might make that argument. But in the event that you wanted to do that, okay, it might make sense to drop down to lower than that. It might make sense in that case to do some 6s or 7s. It doesn't have to be an even number always. It might make sense in that case. So I'm not saying this is the only way to do it. You have to do everything that way. I don't necessarily, but it's a good guideline. It's a good rule. It's generally what I prescribe to clients for their volume work. It's generally what I do. And I mean, I'm at a point in my own training where I probably do more 10s than I do any other rep range. I do more 10s than any other rep range. And my goals are purely strength-based for the most part. But at the end of the day, size equals strength, and anything that helps put extra myofibrillar growth on you is going to make you stronger, right? If it's in the right places. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.